Good day, and welcome to the HUD NSP Open Forum Q&A conference call. Today's conference is being recorded. Participant lines are currently muted. If you would like to signal for a question at any time, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to Janine Cuneo. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another round of NSP's Q&A session. Glad to have everyone today, seeing with the holidays around the corner and many of you NSP2 grantees pushing hard towards your expenditure deadline in early 2012. We do know that busy time of year, and we look forward to your questions. Before we move forward on exactly how to ask all the questions, let me ask those that are part of this call to also introduce themselves. Maybe John, can we start with you?
Sure. This is John Laswick, the team leader for the NSP program here in HUD headquarters.
This is Hunter Kurtz, one of the NSP specialists.
Great. We also have Vinny on the line. And Vinny, why don't I turn it over to you? Can you please tell everyone how they can ask questions today on our Q&A session?
Thanks, Janine. So everyone, you can ask questions two ways. You can either write in your question using the Q&A box in live meeting, and we'll respond to your questions that way. Or you could press star 1 on your phone line, and we will take your questions through the phone. And if your question has been answered while you're on the phone, you can get out of the queue by pressing star 2. So, Janine, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks. While you guys start putting in questions into the queue or changing your status in live meeting from green to purple, or pressing star 1 so you can ask the question verbally, why don't we hand it off to John. Any updates for us on NSP policy alerts, deadlines coming up?
Not too much in the way of new policy that's coming out. I think everyone's focused on the spending deadline for NSP2. We're happy to see that we only have 4 of the 56 grantees in NSP2 that are still under 20% expended as of the beginning of this week. And we have 15 grantees who have gotten over the 50% line already, and another 8 between 40 and 50%. So we're feeling encouraged. The overall rate is still a little below 36%. So I think it's pretty likely that the overall spending will be 50%, and we're just really hoping that everybody individually gets over that line. We have a lot of technical assistance going on, and I think that today's call and others will help you to maybe solve some of those last problems. One thing that we're going to do today is to try out a system in which we do not read the names of the people who write the questions in the belief that perhaps you have questions that you'd rather not be personally associated with, but you'd really like to have an answer to, and we understand that. And so, if nobody uses that, we won't do it anymore. But I think that there probably are people, and I would be one of them, who would be too intimidated by having a lot of people hearing a situation that I think at least is kind of a problem or whatever. So, but those are the ones that we really want to solve. So we're trying to get around that problem, and of course you can always submit through the Ask a Question line. We also have a NSP3 technical assistance deadline coming up this Monday, so we have another $20 million in TA money for another round of TA, and we're actually substantially through far more than halfway through the $50 million that we had for the original NSP2 round of funding. So a lot of that has gone into things like the website, the resource exchange, the toolkits, and things like that that will continue to be useful and don't need to be replicated, so we won't have those expenses again. For those of you who are watching and waiting to see what might emerge from the Project Rebuild situation, that was part of the American Jobs Act in this fall, and the President and the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary have all been traveling around promoting various elements of the Jobs Act, and a number of you have probably hosted one or more of them in your communities as they've been talking that up. Yolanda just told us this morning that there's still some possibility that that could proceed, and that a member of Congress is supposed to be submitting a piece of legislation this morning or today to move that ahead. And if it does happen, we would probably know by the end of the calendar year. So we'll see what happens with that. And then Janine reminded me that we have a DRGR upgrade coming up, which will make a lot more sense of the program income situation, among other things. So, but you know, we are pretty well working full time with NSP2 and keeping up with the NSP1 folks. I feel we're a little behind with the NSP3 new communities, and unfortunately, until we get this new TA money, we have a limited ability to reach those folks, but we are aware of them, and if you're in that category, we encourage you to take those basic CDBG courses. I know they're using, they're including some NSP training in that, so you can get ready, and certainly you can always write in or call in with questions. So with that amount of background, I would say, you know, feel free to call in, or again, if you're a little nervous about the content of your question, just write it in, and we'll read your question without mentioning any names.
Great. Is there anyone that is on the telephone line?
We have no questions from the phone at this time, but again, that is *1.
And at this point, we still don't have anybody in the queue, in the write-in queue for the Q&A. Maybe what we could do while people are still doing that, Hunter, could you tell us about some of the upcoming webinars?
Sure. Just to sort of walk you through what's going to be taking place the rest of this year. We're going to take a Thanksgiving break and start back up on December 1st with a webinar on security issues for NSP grantees. This is going to cover issues for how to deal with vandalism and theft, plus how to process insurance payments and that type of thing that you receive. Then on December 6th, we're going to do a webinar on the DRGR update that's taking place. That will be very helpful in explaining, when the new tools that the DRGR is going to be able to provide, especially the program income, as John was saying. I'm not sure if the DRGR update is going to be released before or after that webinar, but either way, it will still be sort of a great opportunity to learn about that. And then on December 13th, we're going to have the rescheduled Determining Sales Price webinar. Excuse me. I know people have been very anxious for that, so that will pretty much will take us to the end of the year there.
And we've had a couple of situations recently in which grantees have sold houses for above the total development cost, where the current appraised market value is higher than the development cost. So unfortunately, you can't do that. You have to sell for the lower of those two numbers. And so if you find yourself in that situation, please get in touch with your field office or write in here. I mean, there's a way to fix that, basically by refunding the difference to the homeowner, who in effect has paid more than they should have for the home. But there's different techniques for how you do that, and so it's not the end of the world, but you want to get it fixed and not repeat that. Another thing I remembered with Yolanda Chavez asked me to remind people that it's a voluntary piece of information that we've requested through DRGR, but we would still like to know as much as possible how many people you have housed who are below 30% of area median income. It's not an NSP official number, but this is another standard, of course, from home and other places that allows us to know with a little bit finer grain just what's going on out there. So I would imagine most of those people will be rental in rental housing, but we're seeing quite a shift to rental from the original projections of primarily home ownership.
Thanks so much. I'm sure people will look forward to those webinars. Anybody else? Has anybody called in yet?
No questions from the phone yet.
Great. We do have some written in questions, so let me start with the first one. Has headquarters conducted any on-site monitoring? Are there common findings or situations that field office and grantee staff should be looking at?
Well, we have conducted on-site monitoring of the 4 grants that we manage directly out of headquarters, the so-called nationals, which are larger grants consortia that cross state lines. I'm not sure I'd say that of those there's a pattern. I think it's a good question, though, and we should probably do some kind of analysis. I'm trying to think of the things that I hear are going wrong.
The field staff is monitoring the NSP grants also. So it's
right. So I don't know what they're finding. I think there is still, there's kind of some basic policies and procedures. I think that there are, problems that people have run into with real estate transactions. As I mentioned, there are at least a handful of cases where the properties were sold for a higher price. I think a lot of them, though, are just kind of project specific. Is this piece of property really eligible, and how did you determine that, and those kind of things. I can't say that I feel like there's a sort of a vast number of problems in any one area. There are, and of course we've had audits go on too, and I think the treatment of program income comes up. Sometimes grantees are not dispersing program income as soon as they can. I mean, when you get program income, you need to spend that before you, or as part of your next draw, rather than requesting new money and holding on to the program income, unless you have some kind of a revolving loan fund set up. And I think there have been some questions raised about cost reasonableness. I don't always agree with those questions myself. I mean, I think we're, it's one thing to say that, I wouldn't pay $125,000 for this house, or I wouldn't have spent $125,000 fixing it up. But sometimes, if you're the first house, if you're going into the first house in a neighborhood, you're going to end up paying a little more until things start to settle down. So we've had some disagreements with our auditors over some of those cases, and fortunately, I think we've come to a reasonable resolution of them that was not punitive. But our general approach, in CDBG and in NSP is that, we're first interested in fixing, stopping the problem from, to the extent that it continues, and then fixing it and, restoring or getting restitution to the right place, and then preventing it from happening in the future. We work off of the 900 section of the CDBG regulations, 570-910, which talks about essentially an escalating scale of sanctions or remedial actions based on what the problem is and how many times it's recurred and so forth. So it's always better to tell us what's going wrong, or tell us what you fear is going wrong, and let us help you correct it. Many times we can do that without a financial penalty. So it's only one that's gone on forever, or you keep doing it after being advised against it, that you end up really getting into trouble. So we're not out there to hang people up. We're out there to put people in housing and to stabilize neighborhoods.
Don, if you don't mind me adding, one thing we've also heard of findings or concerns, maybe just through monitoring visits, are the affordability periods, resale recapture provisions, and either because the application in home was wrong and the transfer of that application to NSP, or it's a grantee that's highly steeped in CDBG, and so these resale recapture provisions are a bit new.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is more, not so much findings as just, problems that, lack of knowledge that people are having. So that's why we're running a lot of seminars and workshops and training and webinars, and still, hard to know what people want. And I mean, I think just this 2 days ago we had a webinar about developer agreements, and I think that I know for sure that a lot of people are finding themselves in unhappy circumstances that they didn't anticipate when they wrote that agreement. And to me, it's part of the learning curve. Well, if that's the first developer agreement you ever wrote, chances are it's, maybe have some weak spots. But now people are more knowledgeable, and they've kind of seen what might go wrong, and so they're coming back in and saying, let's get these things fixed. And if that's your attitude, if you're trying to fix things and you're trying to make your program right, we'll work with you, and we're not going to flog you too hard. So
Great. Then I go to the next question is on NSP2 expenditure guideline. The question is, what is the deadline related to occupancy of units, and particularly expenditures and occupancy of the set-aside units?
that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. Yeah, there is no deadline on occupancy. And so we have an expenditure deadline for NSP2 and 1, 2, and 3, but we do not count a unit as complete and as having met a national objective until it is serving someone by having them living in it. And we fully understand that that doesn't happen immediately upon spending the money. So, a typical real estate cycle is probably around 4 years from start to finish. So if your program has 3 years in it, you may well go 1 year beyond the end of your spending deadline before you actually have individuals housed in the housing units. And if you've got land banks, it's going to be an even longer process. So I know that from having talked to a couple of grantees that there's a sort of concern that, well, we have to spend this money. Does that mean we have to have people in the houses? No, absolutely not. And it's a spending deadline, and then the actual occupancy is then going to be what drives when you can close your grant out. So you won't be able to close out your grant until you have housed the minimum number of people that were projected. And so that might be 4 years, that might be 5 years. And we're writing closeout rules that will describe how that's going to happen. But in some cases, it may be sort of an indefinite period. We don't want it to go that far. Most of the grants that we are operating, all the NSP1 and most of the NSP3 and many of the NSP2 grants have an entitlement CDBG community involved or are primarily involved in the NSP2. And so there's an ability for us to kind of roll that into the block grant program at some stage. It's going to be different for a nonprofit consortium that doesn't have any cities or counties or states as part of it. But you should not worry about getting, sort of hurrying up to get people into houses that are not ready yet. We're not expecting that, and we're not going to hold that against you. We want you to do a good quality job and to get the right people who can afford the housing into those units, and we know that that's going to take a little longer than the expenditure period itself.
Great, thanks. There's another question regarding NSP2. In our NSP2 target area, we have 3 houses which are adjacent and are listed as estates. They have been vacant for at least 5 months. This is an area where we could make a serious impact on this neighborhood. We have looked at a condemnation, although they are not to that point. We've also looked at the tax situation, but it appears that they are relatively current. Are there any instances where the city could purchase these properties for purchase, rehab, resale, even though they are estates?
In a state, you mean like the owner has died? Is that what you're saying? like an estate?
It unfortunately doesn't clarify. We can ask this questioner if they want to call in, and they can define that more if you'd like.
Okay. Well, I'm going to assume, because I've worked with some of these when I was in local government, those are hard to deal with because, you know, they may be, they may have passed into some sort of a trust with a bunch of different heirs, and, you know, they live all over the place and they don't agree with each other. And, you know, if they're current on their taxes and they don't have any mortgages and they're not willing to sell, there's really not a lot you can do. You know, and even as you suggest, the condemnation process can string out for 2-3 years, so that's not an immediate solution either. I mean, your best bet, I think, with those kind of properties is to try to find someone who can, who is the sole owner or who can speak for the majority of the owners and who is willing to sell. You know, our definition of abandoned, I mean, you know, you'd have to start, you know, proceedings if they are in failing condition. You know, if you want to start citing them for hazardous conditions and that sort of thing, you could get to the position, presumably, where you could acquire them as abandoned. But if the sellers are current on their taxes, and you know, it's still going to be, you're still going to be back to having to negotiate. So it's a tough problem, and you know, I've seen those kind of houses in neighborhoods, and you think, God, this would be just a great location, or sometimes it's just a vacant lot, but it's got 17 heirs, and you never get them to agree on it. So I think that you, as big of a blighting influence as that is, my sense, just from my limited personal experience, is that if you can't get something to kind of pop fairly early on some of those, it may not be worth the time that you put into trying to bust them out of that situation, because you don't have a lot of leverage.
Great, thanks, John. Our next question is around demolition and subsequent beneficiary reporting. So in an NSP 1 demolition-only activity which meets an LMMA national objective, does this restriction need to be placed on that land? And what is the beneficiary reporting expectation, especially if no development is expected?
Okay. Our demo memo, as we're calling it here, is advancing. It's not past the attorneys yet, but so there's a couple of distinctions that you want to make here. One is that if the property is under if you have less than $25,000 of NSP money in this property to demolish it and or acquire it, or whatever else you had to do, and the project and the demolition meets an area benefit requirement as described in the notice, then your work is done. If the property is over $25,000, you have to put a lien on the property for the amount of the demolition, so that if the property is ever sold, the city or the grantee can be reimbursed for that cost. If you actually have acquired it, then you don't have that situation, but you may have more than $25,000 into it. So then the question is, do you have a subsequent use? So if you can demolish a property and it just sits there, whether you own it or not, and it doesn't do anything but sit there and hopefully get the grass mowed or whatever, there is no sort of ongoing responsibility to provide a second beneficiary. But if you're trying to get a house developed there or some other use developed there, then the subsequent use has to meet a national objective. Now, if it's a house, that's easy enough to measure. Where it gets complicated is when you try to do something that doesn't meet the eligibility requirements, such as economic development, maybe. In NSP 1, you're in pretty good shape because you can do public improvements. So you could create a little park there if you wanted to do that, or you could create a community garden, and that would be eligible because you could do those things under Use E in NSP 1. NSP 2 and 3, you have to have a redevelopment, a housing redevelopment use. So unless you're intending to put housing there, it becomes very difficult for you to tear down a vacant house and meet a national objective with any of the subsequent uses. So if this sounds complicated, it's because it is. And we're hoping to get this guidance out pretty soon. But if you have a specific situation that you want to ask about, contact your field office or write into the Ask a Question line. But under NSP 1, you have a reasonable latitude in terms of what happens next with the property. So the most common uses that we've heard are community gardens and side lots. We are willing to look at side lots as essentially residential property, and so if you're selling it to the neighbor or donating it to the neighbor or something like that, for their use as a side lot, and they would maintain it, that would still meet a housing objective. It's when where you need to get a little careful, more careful, is when you are doing something that is not an eligible NSP use, and we're trying to clarify, how we do that. But I would say worst case, if you have to sell the property, it means that you have to sell it out of the program for the current market value, just like you would in the CDBG program under, I think it's 570-504. And, so if you have somebody that's willing to pay the market value, then your obligation to the program as far as the national objective and eligible use is absolved because you've reimbursed the program for the value of the property.
Great. Thanks, John. And I think, just to reiterate, if you do have further questions or very specific question around that, feel free to ask a question or call your local field office.
We do have a question. I'm sorry. We do have a question from the phone.
Great. Please, let's take that.
We'll go to Lynette Glass with Hillsborough County, Florida. Please go ahead, Lynette.
Hi, Lynette, are you on?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I actually wasn't sure I got that in on the phone, so I actually just asked the question. It was really interesting because as I was typing, you were kind of just answering it. But anyway, in 2009, we were looking at a multifamily property, and during the due diligence period, we found that the property had a major sinkhole on it. So we dropped the project. Now, 2 years later, because we're still up in our NSP area, we noticed that the the multifamily complex is now completely boarded up, fenced off, obviously vacant, and so we've been talking about should we go back and do something with that. And one of the things we're looking at is just going back and demoing it and then putting a lien on the property because, of course, it would be over what you just mentioned, the $25K. However, we also were looking at this property because we know that there were some serious problems with drainage on the property. The streets flood, very flat area, no swales. And we also know that it's on a very traveled route. So we were thinking if we did buy it, we could go back and maybe put in a park, which as you just mentioned, and maybe some detention to take care of the drainage issues up in that area, and even like a bus landing stop. So the question was just looking at this as this would be under eligible use E, but based on what you're just telling me, just let me make sure I understand, it probably would be best to go back with my NSP1 money from my program income and take care of this and not look at, it is also in my NSP3 target area, and maybe stay away from expending NSP3 dollars on this project. Is that correct?
That's exactly what I do. Yeah, you have a lot more flexibility under NSP3, under NSP1. So, yeah, and I think that's a good example of something that would have a continuing neighborhood benefit. So it doesn't even have to have an active benefit so much as you're removing this sort of dangerous condition. Although sinkhole park sounds like a lot of fun for most kids, I would think.
Well, actually, that we dropped the project, no pun intended, but that actually might have put a detention. I don't know. The area, though, that we know, it's more central to the site. So, yeah, I think it would be just, it's not a very large site. It's a kind of a funky L shape. So we can see what we do. But thanks. I appreciate you answering my question.
Sure.
Great. Anybody else on the phone we can answer?
No other questions at this time.
Great. We do have a lot in the queue. Right in. So let me go to the next one. The individual writes that they have a property that was acquired in rehab with NSP1 funds and is utilized for rental housing stock. The agency that owns the property has been unable to rent the unit. They've also had an AC unit that was stolen from this property, and that agency is requesting to return the unit to the grantee. The county is preparing to release an RFI to donate the unit to a nonprofit agency to own and operate it. But until that happens, can NSP funds be used to maintain the property, for example, lawn maintenance and other additional tasks that may be necessary to ensure that it does not fall into further disrepair?
Yes, definitely. That falls into what might not sound like the right category, but it's considered to be part of disposition. So, and what's happening here is you're having a problem disposing of the property, or it's taking you longer, and that's going to happen. There's always going to be some period of time. I would think that you're going to be holding on to this, and if it's a single-family home and you want to sell it, you're going to have to keep the grass mowed and make it nice looking, and that would be true in this case too. So those costs cannot be added to the total development cost and when you sell it or transfer it, but they are legitimate disposition costs, and if they've acquired it and rehabbed it under, I'm guessing either B or E, disposition is an eligible activity in both of those categories, so you shouldn't have any problems accounting for it in that way.
Great, thank you. Moving to an NSP3 question. With all the natural disasters across the country, will HUD consider amendments to NSP3 plans with adding those communities that don't have a high enough foreclosure score? The mapping tool doesn't recognize those vacancies in foreclosures yet.
Yeah, I know that question's come up, and I'm not positive of the answer, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be no, because we have some flexibility to use NSP funds in disaster recovery, but that would be for eligible properties and eligible neighborhoods. And the way that the legislation is written, it really doesn't make any provision for sort of circumstances beyond anybody's control or that sort of thing. The legislation in the eligible areas, all has to do with the condition of the housing and vacancies and defaulted mortgages and all those sorts of things. And while some of that may occur as a aftermath of the disaster, I don't think it's going to be something that we'll be able to reach. That's just my guess. I think we need to make some kind of some sort of a judgment call and a policy decision on that, and I'll see if we can get something posted on that. But Jessie had a meeting at 2. Maybe if she gets free after that, she can come in and shed some light on that too. But I wouldn't count on it. Yeah, you got to see if she's there. But so if we, I'll put a little star on my notes here, and if we can get an answer to that, we'll come back to it.
Great. The next question is from an individual stating, I have a project we are considering for redevelopment. It may not qualify under the foreclosed or abandoned standard, but may qualify as just simply an infill lot. It's a small portion of a larger dirt lot. Can you tell me what the accepted definition of infill is?
Well, it's funny that Hunter was just rewriting an old FAQ that we had on that. I mean, we look at infill as, sort of the common sense definition of, it's basically it's surrounded by other developed areas, as opposed to sort of the greenfield, edge of town, cornfield, new subdivision in a cornfield, that would not be infill or redevelopable. But anything that's more or less surrounded by other developed land would qualify as infill for our purposes. And you know, as you say, if it's just a vacant lot, that's all you need to be in the redevelopment category under Use E. So it doesn't have to be foreclosed or abandoned. Sometimes they are also, but it's not. It doesn't have to be both. It only has to be vacant. And if it meets the standard that I've described, you know, I think you're okay. If you have further concerns, or if it's developed on half the sides and you know the other sides are open space, I would get a little nervous. But you know, call us or write in with more specifics if this doesn't answer the question.
Great, thanks, John. The next question is someone looking for some guidance on some conflicting answers they've received. So, how do you set maximum rents for NSP1 single-family homes where anticipated residents will be housing choice voucher holders participating in the Housing Authority homeownership program? These homes will be used to help meet the 50% AMI requirement. We received conflicting guidance. The first guidance is A, use the Housing Authority rental standard, FMR in this case, or B, use low home rents. Secondly, once the maximum is set, should utility allowance deductions be made?
Well, I'm not an expert on this area. So I guess my sense is that, you know, if you're going to be using vouchers, that you would probably be playing by the voucher rules. And I think we're more concerned about what the tenant is actually paying than what the nominal rents might be, because, you know, if the voucher is covering some of the difference, then, you know, if they end up being low enough to qualify under low home, under what they're actually paying, then it really doesn't matter. I'm not 100% sure, though. I mean, we've said that you have to have you have to use at least the home affordability standards. Now, if the low home rents are lower than the Housing Authority fair market rents, then I think you'd be better off just writing in and getting a decision, because somebody's going to monitor you someday anyway. But I don't know how far apart they are. And as I say, I'd be more concerned with what the effect is on the tenant than what the nominal rent is, because sometimes, you know, what the rent is set at, it has nothing to do with what the actual payment is by the individual. And my sense is that in the case of the housing voucher, there's actually a cushion in between what the stated rent is and what the person pays, whereas with the low home rents or the high home rents, that's the number, that's what they're paying. So I guess my advice would be is if the effective rent to the tenant is below the low home rents, then you should be okay. If that's not the case, you really ought to write in and let us know. I don't know how utility allowances work in housing choice with vouchers. I mean, with the home rents, they're just in effect saying that you have to recognize that the payment of utilities is a monthly cost as well, and so if the utilities are included in the rent, then you have to account for that, or if they're not included, you have to account for it. I don't know how that would work for the vouchers. Sorry.
Right.
But if you write that question into us, we'll get somebody who does know and get you the answer.
The next question is, has HUD developed program evaluation tools to determine what will happen if NSP2 grantees have all of their funding spent, but the number of units established in an application has not been met in the 3 years? Going back to some of our first questions.
Yeah. Well, have we developed tools? No. Are we thinking about it? Yeah. I mean, I think that we recognize that those. Well, there's two numbers. There's what you told us you would do with your specific program, And then there is the number of 100 units of minimum treatment that we required as kind of a threshold number. I think that, I think in both of those cases we recognize that it's already now, 2.5 years after that whole process started when people wrote their applications, and things have changed a lot. So I think our inclination is to be flexible and to look to see that you did everything that you could do and that you weren't overspending and you weren't over-subsidizing and so forth. But I think that there is, I could tell you that Yolanda Chavez said, well, those, we have to recognize that some of these things were just estimates at the time, and that, nobody's estimates are ever perfect. So on the 100 units, I think most of our communities will make it. There were quite a few grants that were reduced from the original request, and the average reduction was close to 50%. And so I think we would take that into account as well if we did some calculations here to try to assure ourselves that the grants that we did award could treat 100 homes, but there wasn't any guarantee that our calculations were correct on that either. So I think that I can't say that we have a policy yet, but I think that everything I'm hearing is that we're going to try to be reasonable about what you do, and if you come up to 98 units or something like that, we probably, well, if we shoot you, we'll just be with rubber bullets. So
that sounds very gentle, John. The next question is around land banking. So a land bank purchased property via NSP1 funds. It tends to sell land bank properties as is. No NSP or other federal dollars are involved with any rehab costs. What are the lead paint mitigation abatement requirements on a home buyer or rental property buyer in this case?
Well, maybe somebody there knows. I don't think that lead paint comes into it unless you're unless you're actually affecting the structure. So, and then it comes in at different levels of requirements. If you're based on spending levels. So if you're not spending anything on it, it's my understanding that there would not be a lead-based paint requirement that would be triggered. It's only when you go in and start scraping the paint off or ripping the windows out or whatever.
You are required to let the purchaser know if you know of any lead-based paint.
But you're not required to remediate it before you sell it, I think, which is probably the underlying question there.
Okay, great. Just to go back for a quick second before we move on, the earlier question with regards to the estates, someone followed up to make a clarifying comment.
Okay.
And so it was that it is an estate, like an estate sale we were talking about. The heirs on all three of these estates are willing sellers.
Oh, great.
There appears to be no problems with multiple heirs or disputes as to price. Obviously, we would obtain appraisal and base our purchase from that. This is an area where there's a lot of investor speculation in obtaining these properties for a rehab sale. Remote homeownership would really go a long way.
Well, that's great. Well, yeah, so they're vacant. So, I mean, they qualify as vacant. Hey, that's the easiest category. And so there's nothing to prevent your approaching the sellers and the owners and trying to negotiate something that makes sense. And frankly, since they're not foreclosed upon properties, then you're not required to pay a 1% discount either. So if it sounds like it's a reasonably strong market area, you may end up, it'd probably be tough to get a discount, maybe not, but you have a little flexibility there, in other words. So consider yourselves lucky for those circumstances and go for it.
Great. Before we keep going with the write-in, is there any call-in questions?
have no questions in queue, but again, that is *1 to signal.
We'll keep going with the write-ins then. An individual wrote in and says, in a voluntary acquisition of a vacant property, what is the consequence of not strictly following the notice requirements of the URA? Does this affect the eligibility of the property, or just leave open some risk that someone might later come forward claiming to have a tenant entitled to relocation assistance?
I don't think you have a URA liability there if you don't have an existing tenant. The liability that you're describing is actually one that's dealt with through the tenant protections coverage that was added to the Recovery Act and then subsequent legislation. So that's the one where you have to you have to make sure that someone was not illegally booted out, on short notice from the house, and so there's no relocation responsibility if the tenant is not still in the building. What you have to do is look up our guidance from, I think it was the summer of 2009, on tenant protections, and there's a little sort of checklist that you walk through. Well, it's actually kind of a long checklist that you walk through of what do you know about the property and how do you prove something, I mean, how many stones have you turned over to make sure there wasn't a tenant in there? I don't know if Hunter saw this, but in the New York Times on, I think it was Sunday, there was an article about some college students in Merced, California, where they're building a new university, but the dorms haven't kept up with the student population, but they have a lot of foreclosed properties, and there's sort of these McMansions. So there's, they got this picture of a guy sitting in his hot tub with his computer, and it's, like luxury student housing. And so on the second page of the article, they say, well, so it turns out that some of these students were renting from the original owners who had defaulted on their mortgages, and this is exactly the condition that the tenant protection law was written for. We don't run into it that often ourselves, but it's where the owner defaults, the bank forecloses, and the poor tenant who's been paying to the owner and didn't even know the thing was in foreclosure or default suddenly has 90 seconds to get out of there, and tenant protection says you have 90 days. So they said that these students did their homework and they got 90 days tenancy, and I got, damn, tenant protection, does that work? So that's the first one I've heard of. I don't know about you. But yeah, that's, so it's a little tough with tenant protections because you basically have to prove that something was not happening, and that's always difficult. But you can go through utility records and things like that, and there's a pretty good list of suggestions in that guidance. But as far as relocation or any of the notices that apply, those don't apply. The Uniform Act notices don't apply when you're just acquiring a property.
All right, great, John. Next question is around NSP1 land banking. So looking for some guidance on the use of NSP1 for land bank that's involving vacant land and abandoned buildings. Is use of funds for administration of land bank permitted?
Yeah. So we had a couple of webinars and policy guidance pieces recently about the difference between general or program administration and what we call activity delivery costs. And so if you're operating a land bank, you are presumably doing things like trying to find buyers, doing marketing, maybe fixing up the properties a little bit, maintaining them so they don't deteriorate. Those are all part of the land banking acquisition and disposition, and the disposition, as I mentioned earlier, includes all that kind of stuff, all that maintenance and repairs, the minor repairs, not a renovation, but boarding the windows or fixing the roof when it's got a leak, mowing the lawn, shoveling the snow, and those are all eligible as part of the land banking activity, not general administration or program administration, that's subject to the 10% cap. I think so that's good until your money runs out, and so that's what you got to be concerned about is, well, you can maintain them for as long as you have your grant open and you have a budget in land banking, but unless you're selling properties and generating program income, you're going to have you're going to reach a point where it's difficult to keep up with them because there's not enough revenue to do that ongoing upkeep. So your goal needs to be to create enough sales and generate enough income to at least to keep maintaining the balance of the properties. In some markets, that's going to be pretty hard, I think.
I have another follow-up question from earlier on the NSP1 demolition question that was talked about a little bit earlier. Let's get to that. It says, the city demolished a condemned property which was an imminent threat to health and safety in an LMMI area and accordingly met the LMMA national objective. A lien was placed on the property. The property is now being sold by the owner, not the city, to a private developer who will be developing housing with private funding. The lien will be paid and generate program income. Is it correct that the property is being sold by owner free of any restrictions?
Yeah, the restriction is the lien. So you can't. I mean, if it's privately owned and it was privately owned and remains privately owned, you can't control the subsequent use. And we're not saying that you should. It's only when the property is publicly owned that you may incur a responsibility to have a second, to ensure that a subsequent use meets a national objective. So, but in this case, the fact that they are paying off the costs of the demolition and proceeding on their own to do something which would presumably benefit the neighborhood is fine, and you don't have any further responsibilities on that one.
Hopefully that was clarifying to the individual out there. So we have some questions concerning housing counseling. First relates to where the nonprofit is a developer and also is providing housing counseling. Can the grantee enter into a contract with the nonprofit to provide housing counseling and pay them for their services?
I finally got around to changing that little chart that we had in the August 2010 guidance on this. So because it only stated half the answer. So what we were saying was that as a developer, a nonprofit cannot do housing counseling under wearing their developer hat. But if they are also an approved housing counseling agency, they can, under separate contract, do the counseling. So there's no problem with the same organization doing it. It's with the same sort of legal structure doing it. And so I just sent back some changes, and that guidance is going to be changed because a lot of people have the same question, and we were sort of we left you with the wrong impression. But no, you can do that. You just have to do it under a separate contract.
Right. And the second part of this individual's question was, can the grantee also enter into contracts with other counseling agencies who are not developers? And what eligible use would this fall under?
Oh, well, absolutely, you can do that. Any HUD-approved counseling agency can work for you, and in bigger communities, or lots of houses, you probably want more than one. But yeah, so this is considered to be an activity delivery cost of the sale of the property, and so it goes under under eligible use B or E generally, where you're going to acquire, rehab, and sell a property, and it's just considered like the same way that activity delivery costs would include the staff time to do the work write-ups or the staff time to do the income qualification for the family, or any of those sorts of things. Those are all activity costs. They come out of the activity line item, not out of the general administration, program administration line item. They're not subject to the 10% requirement. And we have also said that, you know, not everybody who goes through counseling is going to find out that they want to buy a house. I mean, part of the point of the counseling is that some people are going to realize that, hey, I'm not ready yet, my income isn't good enough, or my credit scores aren't good enough, or whatever. And so those costs can also be charged to the activity, because, you know, we think that housing counseling is working when when something less than 100% of the people are qualifying. So we don't hold that against you. So, you know, originally we said it could be a public service, but I think quite honestly it makes more sense just to consider it an activity delivery cost. And for the ones, you know, that don't make it through, you can just spread that. You could just add that to your activity delivery cost for those activities that you are doing.
Right. The next question is regarding a multifamily property that's been acquired and rehabbed using the 25% set-aside funds, NSP 1 and 3, and it looks like they're targeting very low-income households. They're using the home rents as their guide, and their question is, can the rents be lower than the low home rent and or the FMR rent? They expect some tenants to be very, very low income and don't want them to pay more than 30% of their gross. So can we charge them lower rent?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, those are, when we say they have to be at least as restrictive, in the case of rents, that means no more than those rents. And so you're thinking the right way about them. I mean, the corollary is you know, make sure you have enough cash flow from the sum of all your rents that the property still, you know, can support itself. I mean, maybe you need to have a little more subsidy in up front, and you can do that through NSP. There isn't any real set limit on, you know, there's no sort of set percentage of NSP funds that you can't exceed in a project. But no, you certainly wouldn't want to burden somebody with a rent that's more than they can afford, and particularly for reaching down to that 30% or lower group. And so what it really ends up meaning is that you will probably have to put a deeper level of subsidy in up front, but you can do that, so that's fine.
Getting back to a land banking question, does a separate entity have to be set up for land banks?
Yeah, I'm afraid it says that it can be a governmental agency or a nonprofit, but it has to be established for those purposes. Now, a governmental agency is probably not going to be a separate department or something. So if you've got a municipal kind of situation where you can, you know, it's part of your city real estate department or something like that. I know that Cleveland's land bank started out that way. It has grown out of the city nest, but it started out that way. But if it's any kind of I'm looking up trying to look up the definition here. Okay, it's a governmental or another non-governmental, non-profit entity established at least in part to assemble, temporarily manage, and dispose of vacant land for the purpose of stabilizing neighborhoods. So, you know, at least in part means presumably this agency could do other things. Most of the ones we've seen that are independent, non-profit, freestanding, you know, non-governmental agencies are single purpose for the most part. But I would imagine that if you were to establish it in a county or city government, there's a pretty good chance that there would be other kind of sister activities going on, and that would be okay.
Any questions on the phone lines?
No questions at this time. Again, *1 if you'd like to signal for your question.
Great. Well, we'll keep going with the write-in questions. So this is a question from a community that has a gentleman calling about one of the land bank vacant lots they have. He owns the adjacent property but does not occupy it. He rents it out. He also owes back taxes but is very determined to acquire this lot. He offered to trade the city for a lot he already owns that is buildable. We told him most likely this is not allowed. He told us that he'll pay off his taxes and have the current renters move out so that he can live in it and get the lot. So the questions are, can he do that? Second, if so, how long does he have to occupy the adjacent property before he can acquire the land bank lot next to it?
Well, we don't really specify, those kind of procedures. There isn't a, I think that we're interested in land bank in getting a subsequent use that meets a national objective. So if this individual owns investment property, I'm wondering if he meets the income criteria. But in terms of living in the property or being adjacent to it, none of that really is anything that we have rules on. I mean, certainly land banks may have their own rules on it. You might want to take a look at the toolkit that Dan Kildee and his group did for land banks that's on our website that has a lot of useful tips on these kind of situations, because these are basically local calls. From what you're telling me, I don't believe this individual, and so I don't know what his motivations are, but I don't, I'm not sure I'd deal with them, but that's up to you.
If they've acquired the property for less than $25,000, the change of use provisions are still in play. So,
yeah.
I mean, if they do want to give it to them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if the city or if the grantee has less than $25,000 into this, they can dispose of the property in any way they want. I mean, I guess the bigger question is what do you want? What are your objectives on that street, and is this person going to advance those objectives or not? And let's hope he will. But those kind of calls are up to you, unless the property is worth more than $25,000, and at which point you'd have to either sell it for fair market value or meet a national objective with a subsequent use.
And maybe, John, just for the benefit of the participants on the line, the subsequent question around how long do they have to occupy it, but also for the side lot programs out there, do those homeowners that are going to be receiving the side lots, do they have to meet a national objective via their income qualification?
Yeah, they do. So here's where it gets a little confusing and maybe overly complex. But so let's hope that many of these properties you don't have more than $25,000 into them, at which point you can just give them to the neighbor regardless of their income. If it's worth more than $25,000, then they would have to be a low and moderate income person, or they would have to purchase it at current fair market value, which in a lot of neighborhoods is not a big number. And as our attorneys pointed out to us, and we have very helpful attorneys, they said, well, you could lease it to them, you could sell it to them and finance the sale, over a 20-year period, so that maybe they're paying just a few dollars a month. So you have to sell it for fair market value. You don't have to get cash up front, in order to make that happen. My sense is that most people in these neighborhoods will meet the income test, and if they don't, a lot of the properties will meet the dollar test. And so for those few who don't meet the income test and the property is worth more, you even then have options. You could lease it to them. You could give it. You could put it on a what do you call that? The right-of-way easement.
Easement.
So just create an easement and let them have the use of it in exchange for their maintaining the land, and the ownership stays with the city or the county or the land bank or whoever. So I think there's different ways to skin that cat.
Great. Just one clarifying for the income. it would be applicable for low, moderate, and middle income, correct? It can go all the way up to the 120.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep, no problem. I'll keep going with the questions here, and again, don't hesitate to keep writing in or do *1 and get in the queue for a call. The individual writes, we have various opportunities throughout the state for people to participate in HUD certified home buyer education classes, but a question has come up about alternative sources for these classes. Are there courses available online for those whose schedules limit their ability to attend? I've recently become aware of one specific website, homebuyerfund.com. They claim to meet the requirements for HUD certification, but I'm hesitant to confirm this with our subrecipients. Where might one go to verify this and or find other alternative sources for the education?
That's a good question. Yeah, I know that. I mean, it makes sense, and we've heard of these, sort of upper plain states that, might have one or two agencies, and it's just not physically possible for people to get in there. I mean, if they are truly HUD approved, and then I guess they could do that. From what I've read, there seems to be some hesitation about just the efficacy of online classes compared to in-person classes, in the sense of, that it just sinks in better if you're doing it in person and you have the ability to interact with a counselor and that sort of thing. I don't know. I mean, we have a group here that does certify the housing counseling agencies, and I could try to find out where one would call into to verify that. There's probably something on the HUD website that lists all these places, but I haven't heard of any that are certified, distance kind of learning, but I have, that's not to say there aren't. So maybe we can try to track that down and post a little notice on the in the next listserv newsletter or something like that.
I'll make sure we do so. Now, for those that are wondering, I just went on HUD.gov and searched certified housing counseling agencies, and the first result of the search gave me a website that gives you a map, and it gives you all the HUD-approved housing counseling agencies. Let me give you guys that website. It is HUD.gov/offices/HSG/SFH/HCC and /HCS. We will do that in our weekly bulletin, John, if you'd like to send that out as well.
That'd be good. Yeah, I know that Ruth Ramon's group does that. I've interacted with them a little bit, but not enough to know where they're saying. So, did you notice any distance learning opportunities on there, or they all seem to be physically based someplace? Or
my extremely quick search seems to be physically based, but I'm not sure that they would have a subset within that.
Yeah, and I think that even among the ones that have, that are located in a particular area, there have to be accommodations for these low population states. You're just not going to expect somebody to drive 150 miles each way to take a 2-hour class 4 times or whatever. So anyway, but we'll try to track that down a little better.
We did have a couple of questions from the phone.
Please.
We'll go first to John Ebert with Orange County, New York. Please go ahead.
Hi, on the NSP1, I've read a bridge notice in October 6th of 2008 that limits the use for land banks to residential properties and excludes more or less under eligible use C abandoned or vacant properties. Has that been changed? Or can we now use a land bank to do abandoned and vacant properties?
No, I think it's still, well, what you're reading is actually the first notice, but originally it was, I think originally it said land banks for homes. Now it's for homes and residential properties that have been foreclosed upon.
Right. So not abandoned homes or a vacant lot.
Well, residential property could be a vacant lot if it's zoned for residential.
If it's zoned residential.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I think originally it just said homes, and that left out a lot of vacant, neighborhood lots that would make sense in land banks. But yeah, they left the foreclosed upon requirement in there. That was actually a legislative change with Dodd-Frank, but it wasn't a big. It didn't open up any major doorways or anything. So that you are limited.
We're limited, but if I had a vacant lot in a residentially zoned area as part of a land bank
That was foreclosed upon, yes.
that had been foreclosed upon, the lot itself would have had to have been foreclosed upon.
Well, or it could have been foreclosed upon as a home, and then they demolished the house, but it's still
Okay.
it was a foreclosure, and it's residential property. I think you're okay.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
And we'll go next to Ann Cheney with Commonwealth of Kentucky. Please go ahead, Ann.
Hey, John, I wanted to follow up on the counseling. We have an agency in Kentucky that has developed an online housing counseling program in coordination with NeighborWorks America. We allow folks to utilize that to satisfy the home buyer ed requirement because a component of that, the class itself has quizzes and scoring and a final exam, but a component of it is that the client must actually go to that HUD-approved housing counseling agency and actually meet live and in person with one of the housing counselors. And so it's a bit of a blend, but that might be of help maybe in some other areas. I know that probably 4 or 5 of the agencies in Kentucky offer eHome America as the online alternative to in-person counseling.
Oh yeah, well that's good. That's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is sort of reflects the, kind of a balance between the distance, convenience, but the sort of value of having at least some face-to-face encounter there. So that sounds good, and it's reassuring to hear that you've had this experience with the other agency and that they seem to be qualified and so forth. So, I mean, I think, we're for the convenience and of the home buyers, first of all, but also, we just don't want to get people in, over their heads for any reason. So I think that this hybrid approach makes a lot of sense.
Are there any more questions in the queue?
No other questions from the phone at this time.
Another question that's come in written. We have various opportunities throughout the state for people. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the same question on the home buyer education. I think right now we are without any more questions. So we give it a couple more seconds while I talk a little bit about the resource exchange links for people to either dial in or ask more. We've talked a lot about things like ask a questions or toolkits. You can find that on the HUD's NSP Resource Exchange. The resource library as the first link is where you can find the toolkits and policy alerts and other such resources. You can search FAQs, training materials. This will be posted with the transcript as well as the video, plus all the past webinars and other learning center opportunities. And then also if there's additional policy questions you have, don't hesitate to put it in and ask a question. I believe we're looking at 2 to 3 day turnarounds on those. And then lastly is requesting technical assistance for additional guidance and support for any of these items.
Well, and don't forget we have a cool new multimedia page that has lots of photos, and we'd really encourage you to submit your completed, or before and after pictures if you have them. It's just, I mean, if nothing else, it makes us happy to be able to see what's going on out there. But there's an increasing number of good short videos. So if you find yourself trying to talk to a new council member or somebody like that, what's this program about? NeighborWorks has done some good stuff. I think the Lake Worth, Florida one's probably up there, and I just saw one from Pima County that should be coming out pretty soon. Both really interesting. So we use those a lot, and it's good. I mean, we have when the secretary or assistant secretary wants to know about what's going on in a certain community, a lot of times we can find a picture in it. It just makes the program so much more real.
Is there any more questions in the queue?
We do have another question from the phone. We'll go to Albert Ramos with the City of Orlando. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. And I just have a very brief question. Besides the NSP3 mapping tool, a while ago someone mentioned other tools that we can see current data of delinquent mortgages or hard-hit areas or areas that are going to be prompt to foreclosures. Does anyone knows what mapping tool is besides NSP3?
Well, I think the best one that I know about is Policy Map.
Policy Map.
Yeah, and actually the NSP3 tool was sort of based off of Policy Map. So, but if you go to, I think it's, I don't know, I can't remember if it's policymap.com or policymap.org, but it's really a tremendous site, and you can get, I think most people can get most of the, most information off of it, and so it's got geocoded stuff, down to the block group level for, and what you want to do is go across the top. There's a bunch of little tabs there that when you roll over them, give you a really long list of submenus. So, for example, there's one on government requirements, and it has all the NSP2, all the NSP 1, 2, and 3 areas. It has, I just used it to try to estimate whether we could say that a specified area has more than 51% people above 120% of median income.
Right.
Those kinds of things. So,
Okay.
the NSP3 map can do that too. But Policy Map shows you on a census tract level, I think, the areas that qualify for NSP 1 and 2, and they're constantly updating it for foreclosure data. I mean, they subscribe to Case Schiller and all those services. So, and then we hope to be, well, we will be developing another sort of use for that site. We're in the process of doing that now, which will show the impact of NSP investments in particular areas where you have clusters of investments. So that's not quite ready yet, but I think you'll find that there's a lot on there.
Okay. Great. I will check for that, and that's all I have for now. How do I get out of the queue now so I let somebody else go in?
You just hang up.
I think
Thank you.
Star 2, that's great.
Pound 2. Thank you so much.
And is there anybody else in the queue?
We do have another question from John Ebert. Please go ahead.
Yes, a follow-up on the land bank. I know you did discuss use of funds for, the program delivery. What about for payment of cost to administer the land bank, such as salaries?
Well, again, that would be an activity delivery cost too. You're going to be subject to, whatever your budget limitations are and how much income you can generate. But as long as the costs are reasonable, those are, the same as any administering, the activity delivery costs for any other activity. They're not the general administrative kind of costs are running your entire program and talking to the city council. But, you know, the administrative costs for a land bank would be, you know, talking to potential buyers, you know, putting together advertising programs, you know, showing the properties around.
But suppose the land bank didn't include properties that were exclusively NSP eligible.
Well, I think this definition,
you know, in other words, I have a municipality that's just formed a land bank. It's an older northeastern city, small city. They're very eager to get this off the ground. They recognize the county's administering an NSP program, and we are doing that kind of outside the parameters of this land bank. Had established it prior, you know, our program prior to the land bank formation. Now that the land bank's been formed, they're coming to us and kind of, you know, asking for some assistance through our NSP to further its goal. But I can't say we established it for the purpose of NSP 1.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it has to be your land bank necessarily, you know.
Right.
There's many that are, you know, sort of like in Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, you know, it's sort of a regional land bank. I think the answer to your question on the cost has to do with percentage of the properties in NSP and what percentage aren't. Do some sort of a prorated thing or an indirect cost allocation plan or something like that to say, well, you know, 17% of the properties are NSP properties, so we're not going to spend more than 17% of the, you know, not more than 17% of the administrative costs can be paid by NSP. But you might want to, you know, I think you want to, it's not going to be quite as simple as just
correct.
Pro rata. I think you'd want to talk to your accounting people about how to set that up. But
okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And there are no other questions at this time.
I'm seeing no additional questions in the write-ins. Hunter, is there anything else?
No. No, it's good. I'm about out of answers, so it's good. It just worked out just right. I had like one more, and then I was finished. So, no, it's good. We're, I would say, based on the percentage of write-ins versus call-ins, that people may appreciate having a little less visibility on this, so that's good. I have some notes on a couple of things we need to follow up on. One is the disaster. I don't think we've gotten anything more on that. And one is this housing counseling, and I think that Ann Cheney helped us, as she usually does, with that one. But if we can find out anything more specific on electronic housing counseling, we'll put it in the newsletter next time around. It's a great day in your nation's capital. We hope you're doing better, and everybody have a good Thanksgiving, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks, I guess.
Great. And Vinny, any closeout remarks?
Sorry, I think there is one follow-up question about the, it was the question relating to multifamily projects.
Okay.
Please.
Do you see it, Janine?
I do not. If you can go ahead and read that for us, that'd be great.
Oh, okay. It was about the multifamily project acquired in rehab with 25% set aside through NSP 1 and 3. The follow-up question is, all units will be assisted with NSP and home funds. Can we have the affordability periods in the housing/regulatory agreement be 15 years for the home funds and 55 years for the NSP funds due to the deed subsidies?
Yeah, I mean, sounds a little complicated having different ones if you can make sense out of that. But again, the same as can you charge less rent, you can extend the period longer as long as it's not, you know, as long as you don't go lower than that. We do have almost out the home NSP guidebook. So, but I mean, I guess, yeah, you know, if you can keep track of the units, I would be more concerned from a sort of just a sort of pragmatic standpoint, but certainly from a legal standpoint, there's no, you know, the longer you go, the better it is to on these affordability periods. So, you know, if you're in California or places like that where you want to tie it to a higher standard or just have your own higher standard, that's great. I mean, one of the questions that kept us from resolving this handbook was, well, what happens if you have home and NSP and you want to have one form of affordability for one and one form for the other, and what if you have $39,000 worth of home funds and $39,000 worth of NSP funds, and you really got $78,000 worth, but, you know, we say, well, you can overlap the time periods, but we certainly encourage you to go longer. So that's always preferable if it makes economic sense.
Great for that last one in there. Anything else we've missed?
Somebody heard I had one last answer, so they squeezed it out of me, huh?
I think
Oh,
there's
and I've got another follow-up.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I don't have any more answers.
I'm going to tweak your brain one more time. This is a follow-up to the URI question earlier. Says, isn't a notice still required when there's a voluntary acquisition of a vacant property to put the seller on notice that the buyer does not have the power of eminent domain?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was thinking of the relocation notices, but no, you're correct, and we have some guidance on that as well. But yeah, you do have to do that, and you know, if it's you have to tell them whether you have those powers and whether you use them and that sort of thing. So that was my mistake. Sorry.
Thank you. And then yeah, the subsequent question is what happens if the notice wasn't provided, or if it was provided at the same time as the purchase contract?
I'm not sure. I would suggest writing that one in. We have some experts here, or you know, depending on. I think you probably got a better shot of getting an answer if you go through your field office, and we have relocation experts out in most of the regions across the country who are really quite good on these things, and usually they can solve it for you over the telephone. So what you want to do is find out who your regional relocation person is, and give her or him a call and get that straightened out.
There's one additional person that wrote in a comment just letting people know that in addition to Policy Map, you can also go to the CPD map at egis.hud.gov/CPD maps. And although NSP3 is not on there, NSP1 and 2 is, as well as other CPD programs.
Wow.
The individual might have found that useful as well.
Yeah, that's great.
So as I keep saying, I keep teasing everyone that we're almost done, but I'm not seeing anything more pop up. As always, though, don't hesitate to call your field offices, ask the questions, and request technical assistance for anything else. And hope everyone has a nice holiday, as this is bye week next week for the webinars. We'll come back for securities and DRGR coming up in the weeks to follow. Please don't hesitate to link to our survey and give us feedback, as well as include any additional items you'd like to have us cover in the future for webinars. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
That does conclude today's conference call. Thank you all for your participation.